The Talmud in Baba Batra says, "Manda ba'ilmeve chasida." If a person wants to be saintly, chasid, leilaf mile de avot. They should study the words of Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers. And there are those who say nizikin, the laws of nizikin, of damages. And there are those who say the laws of brachot, of blessings. So what are these three categories? For people who want to be saintly, who want to be chassid, the three categories are Pirkei Avot. Well, nizikin is obvious. That's damages between man and their fellow. What we would call natural morality, not to hurt other people. Pirkei Avot is how to improve yourself as an individual. Tikkun hamidot, repairing our bad traits. And brachot, blessings, are between man and God. So we have three relationships here: between man and man, between man and him or herself, and between man and God. These three relationships, if you want to be a saintly, you have to work on all three simultaneously. So maybe that's what he was referring to, that the Gemara in Baba Batra. So today I'd like to talk about Orort chapter 4. In this chapter, Rav Kook moves from individual tshuva to national and international tshuva, which, national tshuva is actually mentioned in the book of Devarim, chapter 30. V'shav Hashem Elohecha Tshuvutcha. God will return your exiles. And the term there is shav, from the word tshuva. And it even says there, tatashuv, and you, meaning the Jewish people, will also come back. Meaning not just physically to the land, but also to the path that God wanted. So in that chapter 30, you have both. You have penitence and actual returning to the land, which is part of the national penitence of the Jewish people. A moment. Okay. I'm here in the teacher's room at Bar Ilan. Therefore, you see a different background. Okay, so let's look at this. Again, from the Boxer translation, I took this. And there are some very interesting things in this chapter. After this chapter, I'm going to leave Orort HaTeshuva and jump to places in the book Orot, and maybe a few places in Musar Orot HaKodesh. Okay, so let's see this one, chapter 4. Private penitence and public penitence in the world and in the Jewish people. The currents of particular and general penitence rush along. Rav Kook always writes in a very poetic language, and the poetic language is there because he's also hiding ideas, and he's hoping that the language will cover up the ideas, so those who dig down a little bit deeper, they'll figure what he means. They're like the streams of a flame on the surface of the sun, which in an unceasing struggle, break out and ascend, and endow life to countless worlds and numberless creatures. Remember, the sun, with its heat, it gives life. Without sunlight, the plants, all the vegetation, and animals and humans cannot survive without the sun. Especially plant life, because they need the sun for photosynthesis in order to survive. One is powerless to absorb the multitude of varying colors that emanate from this great sun that shines on all the worlds, the sun of Teshuva. So Teshuva, just like the sun gives life, Teshuva gives life. There are so many that come with such mighty sweeps, such wondrous speed. They come from the source of life itself, for whom time is only a limited expression of his providential design. In other words, there is a source of life, and tshuva means coming back to the source of life. Rav Kook says in one place, what is the definition of freedom? Herut. Freedom means to be yourself. That's why matzah is a symbol of freedom, because matzah is the dough which was not forced to be in a form that it didn't want to be in. It can just be itself, a formless type of bread, like a lafa, or like the way we make matzah today. So matzah represents freedom because it's formless. It can do whatever it wants. So to be free is to be yourself. Sometimes we enslave ourselves by habits that we acquire and are not able to break. That's also a form of servitude. Just like a person who is an alcoholic, they can't break out. They might want to break out if they realize that they have the hitmakrut, the addiction. But even if they realize that, they might not be able to. There are things that are stronger than us. There was a video by Rabbi Dr. Abraham Twersky. He was from a Hasidic family, and he was a psychiatrist by profession. Maybe I mentioned him. I don't remember if I did. And in Pittsburgh, and he dealt with alcoholism. And so he tells a story about a fellow came to his clinic. Maybe I told this, I can't remember. So a fellow comes to his clinic, and he has to meet with one of the counselors. And the counselor says to him, why did you come? Says, I realized I'm an addict. I want to break out of it. Counselor says, good, that's step one. Says, step two, you have to pray. The man says, pray? I'm an atheist. What's the point of praying? Says, look, you want to break out of the habit or you don't? He says, yes, I do. Then you have to pray. What does it matter what you believe or not? So Rabbi Twersky says, I met the fellow 8 months later. And the fellow says to me, I am now been dry for the last 5 months. I don't drink. I pray every day. I'm still an atheist, he says. But at least when I pray, I realize that I am not God. So that's also realization. Sometimes we think we're in control, that we can do whatever we want. And the humility of realizing we're not in control sometimes helps us set our path a little bit better. We come from the source itself, for who time is only a limited expression of his providential design. Meaning, just like space, time was also created. But Teshuva, according to the Midrash, came before the world was created. I think I mentioned this. The Midrash says in Breshit Rabbah, 7 things were created before the world. Right, I mentioned this, I think, last time. But I never remember if I mentioned here or another class. What were the 7 things before the world was created? One of them was the Torah. One of them was the idea of the Jewish people. One of them was the temple. One of them was the patriarchs, the Avot. One was the name of the Mashiach, name of the Messiah. Trying to remember. And Rabbi Akiva says even Teshuva. The idea of goals that are set before the world is created means, what are the goals of the world? Because before a person builds a house, they have an idea of why they're building the house. They want to bring their family into the house. They want to bring their friends. They want to entertain in the house. They want to have a study hall in the house, whatever it is. But they envision it before they build the house. So when it says these are the things that God envisioned before creating the universe, it's like saying these are the goals of the universe. Another one was Kisei Kavod, God's throne. We're up to 6 and plus 1. Yeah. So the Teshuva was one of them, according to Rabbi Akiva. Why is Teshuva one of the goals of the universe? Because if you're creating mankind, and man is not a perfect being, and that's why we have free will to decide whether we want to be good or bad in every scenario. So then you need the concept of tshuva, because the world cannot exist if there is no possibility of us changing our ways. If for every time we're going to make a mistake, we are hit by a lightning bolt, there's no real free will. If I flick on a switch of electricity on Shabbat, and then a hand comes out of the heaven and hits me in the face, there's no free will. It's only if I have the chance of flicking the switch on Shabbat and nothing happens that I have free will. A lot of the commentaries say that the generation where the Torah was given, where they stood at Sinai and God appeared to them at Sinai, was a necessity of history, but it was not good for that generation because it took away their free will. How can you stand at Sinai and not say whatever God said we will do? When the Talmud says in Shabbat that God picked up the mountain, kafalem har kegigit, and said, either you accept the Torah or I will put this mountain on top of you, it's a metaphor. And the meaning of the metaphor is when you actually experience revelation and God says to you, these are my commands, there is no room for free will. It's only when God hides his face, there's room for free will. If a parent were to use all these different things that we have today, video systems and Pegasus, to track down what their child is doing at every moment, and to, what do they call it, micro-supervise what the child is doing at every moment, the child can't grow. They need space. They need the chance to fall down and hurt themselves. They need a chance to make mistakes, or else how do you grow? If you're macro-managed by your parent, how do you grow? Just like an employee who's micromanaged cannot grow. They need the space to make a mistake, and then they learn from their mistakes and hopefully do a little bit better. So in the same vein, God doesn't micromanage the world, because or else what's the point of the world in the first place? So, we say, they come from the source of life itself, for whom time is only a limited expression of his providential design. The Rabbeinu Bachaya ben Asher also says that time was created together with the creation of the universe, which, by the way, is the perception today also, according to modern physics. That time and space are just two variations of the same idea, and all of them were created for this world. Individual and the collective soul. Individual, we understand. Collective soul means the collective soul of Israel. In Kabbalistic literature, when they say Knesset Yisrael, or when Rav Kook says Klal Yisrael, the collective of Israel, it is referring to this idea that the whole Jewish people sort of are connected at the root, as if we have a national soul. This, by the way, you can find in the book of Tanya of Chabad, chapter 32, the idea of all Jews connected to a single soul. And of course, we all have our own, you might say, tzinorot, or pipes, which connect us, or funnels. But we're all sort of connected to that single soul. You can deny that connection, and there are plenty of Jews who do so. That's not impossible, but it does exist. So you have the individual, the collective soul of Israel, world soul, meaning mankind. It's all connected. We all descend from Adam and Eve, and later from Noah. And the soul of all realms of being, meaning not only humankind is all connected, the universe is connected. First of all, we're connected to the animals, and to the plants, and to the minerals. And actually, you can see that, because within the human body, we have intellect, so that's the level of mankind. Our functions are very similar to the animals. From our emotions down, we're very much like the animals. We grow like plants, and we even have dead cells, like minerals, in our hair, in our teeth, in our nails. And we even have minerals within us. We have silver and gold and copper and zinc and flowing within our blood. So we really are taking part in all the four levels, the Aristotelian levels of life, which is minerals and vegetation and animals and man. So we all are part of this planet. And the planet is part of a cosmos, an interesting part of the cosmos. In fact, the question which is asked today a lot by many scientists is how come we've been sending out radio waves into the universe for years and years and nobody's responded? So then you have the theories of the people say, well, maybe there were response, but NATO and whatever are hiding it, which is possible. And then there are the others that say maybe there's no response because there is nobody out there. Of course, the third possibility is that there's no response because they're not as developed as we are. And a fourth possibility is that there's no response because they're too far away anyhow for us to even reach them. And then, of course, there's a fifth possibility that they don't respond because maybe the world itself is just, what's the term? Simulation. So, yeah, all these questions are interesting questions. You know that the Lubavitch Rebbe implies in one of his books, I mean, the one who just passed away, Menachem Schneerson, the last Lubavitch Rebbe, number 7, he implies in one of his books that the world is a simulation. It just occurred to me years later. This is something I read maybe 20 years ago, and it occurred to me because somebody asked him a question. It's a book that Chabad put out on science and Judaism years ago. Chabad put out, and there's a letter there by Menachem Mendel Schneerson. And somebody says to him, if the world was created so many billions of years ago, and mankind so many millions of years ago, then how does the Torah say it was 5-7? Okay, I have my own way of addressing this, but I just want to say what Menachem Mendel Schneerson says. 5783, of course, passed 2 years ago. So Rav Schneerson says something very interesting. He says, well, God could create a universe that looks like it's billion of years old. Right? He can create a universe that looks like it's billions of years old. So when you look at it, you see a world that is very vast, and really, rationally, it looks like it was created billions of years ago. That's what we call a simulation, by the way, which is very interesting because that's something that scientists are talking about today. Okay, I want to leave that now. That's just something I was thinking about. That's why it came to the forefront. Okay, let's go back to this. The souls of all realms of being crying out like a fierce lioness in anguish for total perfection, for an ideal form of existence, and we feel the pain that purges us. The world was created incomplete. This is an idea of Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, where he says that God created, I think I talked about this when I talked about redemption, God created an incomplete world, because what's the point of having a world where mankind has nothing to do? The incompletion within the world, which means existence is incomplete, mankind is incomplete, and therefore the animals are incomplete. Everything becomes incomplete. When human beings complete themselves, because we are the crown of the universe, and we are the only part of the universe that we're aware of that is both conscious and has free will. So in that sense, we're the part of the universe that can make the change. So when we make that change, it reverberates. As it says that when human beings, in futuristic times, that we call messianic time, when human beings will not kill each other anymore, lo yisagoyel goyecherev, nation shall not raise sword against other nation, nor shall they practice war, learn war anymore. It says even about the animals in chapter 11 of Yeshayahu, lo yareu v'lo yashchitu b'chol har kochi, that even the animals will not eat each other anymore. V'gar ze'evin keves, which means that the wolf and the lamb shall lie together. Because once human beings are not killing each other, then the animals won't either. They're a reflection of us. But when human beings act like animals, so animals really like animals. When human beings start acting like angels, the animals start acting like they're supposed to too. Vigar ze'evim keves. Yeah. There's a story about Henry Kissinger. Says, of course, I think he's still around. Kaneno Hari is over 90. So they say when Henry Kissinger retired, he opened up a zoo. It was called the Biblical Zoo in Washington, and they had a big cage, and it said the wolf and the lion, the wolf and the lamb living together. So people would pay money every day to see the wolf and the lamb living together. This was an Israeli joke after 1973, to the Yom Kippur War. So the wolf and the lamb lying together. So people were paying money, but it was closed every day at 5:00. Somebody said, Henry, why close it at 5:00? All these people are coming paying so much money, you can make more. It says, unfortunately, at 5:00, we have to switch the lamb. So, yeah. So there's a way to have a world where the wolf and the lamb work together, but it starts with human beings, not destroying each other. That's the way we understand it. So Rambam, of course, understands it in a metaphor. It says the wolf and the lamb shall lie together. It means that the lamb, meaning the people of Israel, and the other nations won't be at war with each other and won't try to subdue each other, and there won't be anti-Semitism. That's the way Maimonides understands it as a metaphor. But for the Kabbalists, there's almost like an organic connection between all the parts of creation. The individual and the collective soul, the world soul and the soul of all realms, cries out like a fierce lioness in anguish for perfection, for an ideal form of existence. We feel the pain, meaning of the incompletion, and it purges us. Like salt that seasons the meat, purges away the bitterness. When you realize there's an imperfection, that's the beginning of teshuva. Because if everything's fine, then what do I have to do? I'm sorry. Right? What do I have to do when everything is already perfect? It is impossible to express this vastly profound concept. We will place all things in the context of the divine unity. We will invoke the mystical meaning of the names of God. A punctuation mark, which means it's really nikuda in Hebrew, which means a dot. And a new heaven and a new earth, and all their fullness are contained in this dot. A letter, and all the worlds become revealed. Words, and countless worlds, multitudes of creation, tranquil and joyous, abounding with gladness, full of peace and truth, and the soul grows towards perfection. Here he's talking about a Kabbalistic idea, and the idea is something like this. This is a dot. The letter Yud, by the way, is like a dot. Kabbalistic thought, the Yud is a dot. That's why God's name starts with a dot. Sometimes they talk about kutsoshel Yud, which means the sliver, the point at the top of the Yud. There's an expression in Hebrew when people are overly meticulous. They care too much about the point of the Yud, kutsoshel Yud. In other words, they're very meticulous. They don't let anything go by them. Right. So you have the point, which becomes the Yud, but the Yud itself is like a point. It's like a dot. In geometry, as you know, you have a point. It means something which has no dimensions. You have 2 points. You can already have a line connects the 2 points. It's called one dimension. And of course, when you have 3 points, you can already have 2 dimensions. If you want, you can call it like this. Dimension, 2 dimensions. Excuse me, this would be, I'm sorry. You have a dot, and you have a line connecting between 2 dots. It's the Vav. Then that's called one dimension. No dimension, 1 dimension, 2 dimensions is the Daled, because you have horizontal and vertical. Then, if you have horizontal and then vertical, and then another yud, which is another dot, the other dot then be depth, which is the third dimension. So that's yud a, is God's name, right? Yud, vav dalad, is the letter yud spelled out, and the hey, of course, which is the yud inside the dalad, that's already the depth. It's going into the paper. This one time from Rabbi Yitzchak Ginsburg. So it actually says the Talmud says on the verse Ki b'yah Hashem sur olamim, that God created the worlds in plural with yud hey b'yah. So yud represents this world and hey represents the world to come. Oh, the opposite. Yud is the world to come, I'm sorry, and hey is this world. That's called Ki b'yah Hashem sur olamim. Hey is this world, yud is the world to come. This world is the world of 3 dimensions. The world above it doesn't have 3 dimensions. It's represented by 2 dimensions, 1 dimension, and by no dimensions. It's called the world of the Yud. 3 worlds above this world. For 4 worlds altogether, Kabbalistically, these are the 3 worlds above us. Atzilut, Bria, Yetzira. This is our world, which is called Malchut. So this is so Rav Kook is talking about a dot, which is like the beginning of existence. We also find this in the writings of Yisrael Srug, the way it is expanded in the writings of Emek HaMelech, Rav Naftali Bachrach. Yisrael Srug is, he was sort of a student of the group who studied under the Ari. It's not clear if he himself studied under the Ari in Tzfat, but he did know the group of the Ari who studied with Chaim Vital. And he comes to Italy and he brings Luriana Kabbalah to Italy in the end of the 16th century, early 17th century. And he has this idea that the world starts with a Yud, which is not in the writings of Rav Chaim Vital. Okay, let's go back to Rav Kook. Did it just go? Here? Yes. Oh, I don't know if you can see that. One moment. Okay, so here he ended off with this Kabbalistic idea. The world is formulated out of letters and words, according to the book of Yetzirah, the book of formation, of creation. And letters, of course, start with dots. Okay, that was chapter 1. And chapter 1, he introduces this idea of 4 levels of Teshuva. Individual Teshuva, national Teshuva, international Teshuva among human beings, meaning the whole world, not just the Jewish people. And then ipso facto, the whole universe starts being united because human beings are united. In Kabbalistic thought, the fact that human beings on planet Earth will unite itself, this will affect the rest of the world, because the world was created for us. There are those who disagree with that, by the way, which is okay. The question is, are there simultaneous worlds? That would not bother me. If there were, they would have their own problems, as I always say. Every world with its problems. But at least as far as we know at the moment, we seem to be on a lone boat. But it would not be a problem if we discovered that there are other boats out there. What is more probable is that there are other dimensions. Okay. Through penitence, Teshuva, all things are reunited with God. Through the fact that Teshuva is operative in all worlds, all things are returned and reattached to the realm of divine perfection. This is also a Kabbalistic concept. The Kabbalistic concept is that Teshuva actually happened before the world happened, before there are human beings. It's part of the ebb and the flow of life. In Kabbalistic and Lurianic Kabbalah, when God is creating the world in a primordial level, the vessels break, which means the primordial world already broke before it was able to come to us. And that was necessary in order to rebuild it. So that life itself is based on, let's call it destruction and rebuilding. In fact, we can see that in the human body. It's called in chapter 1 of Yechezkel, V'hachayot ratzo v'shov, kemareh habazak. Chayot is a type of angel. Ezekiel sees these angels running back and forth like streaks of lightning. And it says, ratzo v'shov, back and forth like lightning. Chassidut explains, why does it say chayot? Because it's chayut, it's the vitality. The vitality of life is constantly replenishing itself at every moment. The world is being recreated at every moment. God is recreating the universe at every moment. We can see this in the human body. At every moment, we're taking in oxygen. When we take in oxygen, it oxygenates our blood through the lungs. And then the blood is able to go into the heart. And the heart gives new oxygen to the body. And when this blood gives oxygen to the rest of the body, it comes back without the oxygen, goes back into the heart. We breathe out the carbon dioxide, breathe in more oxygen, and again, the pattern starts all over again. So we're in a constant pattern of ratzo v'shov, of the life force coming in and going out at every moment. With the getting rid of the carbon dioxide, bringing in the new oxygen to oxygenate the blood, we're constantly making this cycle. And in that sense, the cycles are, and even the cycle of the breath and the cycle of the blood, and of course, the cycle of every cell. The cells are constantly replenishing themselves. At every moment, a cell dies and a cell is born. Every 7 years, every cell in our body has been replaced. Once every 7 years, except for some of the gray matter in our brain. Every other cell in our body was replaced every 7 years. Every 7 years, you're a different individual. But the cells have memory in the DNA, so they remember what you're supposed to look like, and they even remember what age you're supposed to be. Your biological age, of course. So, or else we would just look the same all the time. The Talmud says originally people did, but then people couldn't tell the difference between the son, the father, and the grandfather. It became a little confusing. It says that Abraham was the first one who experienced zikna, which is old age. Before that, people just lived and died. It says Yaakov was the first one to experience being sick before dying. So, anyhow, these are, Talmud says that in Brachot. So life is, as I said, it's this sort of like cycle. It works in these cycles. And so the whole universe is a cycle which is constantly replenishing itself, according to the Ari. Just like the human body is a model, life is being replenished in the universe every day. The sun comes up and it gives its warmth to the vegetation, and there's chlorophyll and the plants start to grow. And they give out oxygen and they take in carbon dioxide from us and from other living beings. And this is another cycle of the ecosystem, etc., etc. So through penitence, all things are united with God. Through the fact that penitence is operative in all the worlds, things are returned and reattached to the realm of the divine perfection. Through the thoughts of penitence, its conceptual implications, and the feelings it engenders, the basic character of our thinking, our imagination, our knowledge, our will, and our feelings is transformed and placed again within the context of the holy order of the divine. By the way, here you have this idea. Thinking, our imagination, our knowledge, our will, our feelings, it's better actually to see this in the Hebrew. because I remember that the Hebrew here was very significant, but in the English it doesn't work as well, I can see. So I don't remember by heart exactly what the Hebrew says, but it's different levels within the human soul according to the Kabbalah. I think the translation here is not what I remember in the Hebrew. But I'm going to leave this at the moment. 3. General penitence, meaning the penitence of the world, tshuva of the world. Meaning not only is there national tshuva of the Jewish people, and national tshuva of Jewish people means first and foremost leaving the exile, coming back to the land of Israel. For Rav Kook, the Zionist movement is an act of tshuva. It's the Jews wanting to come home. Of course, the paradox here is that one of the biggest instigators of the Zionist movement was Jews who rebelled against Torah. They're not the only ones, but I'm just saying they were a big impetus within the movement. So Rav Kook would say, well...
Sorry for interrupting you, but this strikes a chord in me. Are we really sure that those Jews were rebelling against tradition?
They definitely were rebelling. Rav Kook has a very interesting understanding of that generation. There definitely was a rebellion. Take somebody like Joseph Chaim Brenner. Joseph Chaim Brenner is an ideologue of the labor movement. He is born in Poland into a very religious family, a Hasidic family. He studies in the Lubavitch Yeshiva, becomes best friends with the Rosh Yeshiva's son. Forget the name at the time. Both of them get kicked out of the yeshiva for studying Hebrew literature in secret, because if you study Hebrew literature, that means you were involved in the Haskalah movement, the Jewish Enlightenment, and then the next step is probably you're going to move away from Torah. So they would just expel them from the yeshivot, from certain yeshivot, especially the Hasidic ones. And both of them decide to come to Israel at the beginning of the 20th century.
Yes.
Brenner first goes to London, where he publishes a Hebrew daily journal called Hashachar, which was really unbelievable. He did it almost with no money. Then he comes to Israel. He's not very good in working the land, so he becomes an ideologue and writing books and talking to people, etc. But he rebelled. He and the Rosh Yeshiva's son rebelled because they were looking for wider horizons, did not find it, and the only thing open to them, which would accept their rebellion, was people who thought like them, and a lot of them were in Israel at the time.
But may I just question, for the sake of understanding rebellion, they rebelled against, because when you rebel against something, or you rebel against a certain state of affairs. So they were rebelling against a certain establishment, but not.
They were rebelling against a narrow-minded Jewish lifestyle that could not be inclusive enough to understand that the fact that a young man wants to study the Hebrew, modern Hebrew, maybe they're not really rebelling against the Torah.
Yes, but can we perhaps enlarge the scope and say that the reading or the interest in Hebrew literatures is just a preparation to establish a Hebrew state or a Hebrew.
Well, first of all, that's 100% correct, because all the Hebraeus
and therefore it's not really rebellious. It's just a preparation in view.
Well, all the Hebraeus of the late 19th century, early 20th century were Hebraeus because of the Zionist movement.
Yes,
that is true. I'm talking about the Hebraeus as, let's say, opposed to the Yiddishes. But the Hebraeus, it really was an introduction to what they were hoping would be a Jewish Renaissance in the land of Israel. Yes. However, maybe because they were already considered outcasts, or maybe because they were already being under suspect of being part of the Haskalah movement, they did rebel against the Jewish society where they came from, and eventually removed from themselves the kiyum mitzvot, the keeping of the mitzvot. Not everybody. Take, for instance, Avraham David Gordon, Aleph David Gordon, who is another ideologue of the, let's say, the labor movement. And at the age of 40, makes Aliyah to Israel, which was considered
Yeah.
old in those days. It was usually very young people, 16, 17, 18, 20. So at the age of 40, he goes and he demands to work in a moshav and do, even though it's difficult for him, but he creates this whole philosophy that the people have to get back to nature, back to the land, because we lost that in the galut. Gordon himself never really turned his back fully to the Torah. He actually kept at least the mitzvot lo ta'aseh for the vast majority of his life.
Yes. But
Not
Rav,
all the mitzvot ta'aseh, but a lot of the mitzvot lo ta'aseh. He was,
yes.
like he would not eat not kosher. He tried to do what he could to incorporate things into his new lifestyle. But not everybody was like that.
Yes. Because I often ask myself the question, how could we even imagine a conquest or a settlement of the land of Israel in the beginning of the 20th century in another way? Did we expect in any time that Bachurei Yeshivot, with all due respect, of course, with all due respect, would have taken the shovels and arms and settled the lands of Israel? They were, of course, but not in their majority. So the question is, can we even imagine an alternative?
Rav Kook writes exactly that, but he doesn't write it as clearly as you stated it. But he writes exactly that idea in his book, Our
imagination today, a posteriori. We can use our imagination and say, let's imagine for a second thousands of Bachurei Yeshiva that stand up from the ghettos of Europe and head to the land of Israel.
Right.
How would that look like? With arms?
As I said, it probably would have looked like the way it actually happened. Remember that Jews under communism, and communism is an idea that starts at the end of the 19th century and gets stronger as the Russian Revolution is approaching. Jews became communists because they were promised equal rights in Russia, which included the Ukraine. They were promised equal rights by the Russians. And whenever Jews are promised equal rights, they're willing to, unfortunately, throw everything. Just like happened in Germany, the emancipation will give you equal rights. A lot of Jews assimilated because not everybody is strong enough to stand up to an exile where you're constantly persecuted. And the same thing happened in Russia. When Lenin comes to power with the Russian Revolution, a lot of Jews, they feel like, okay, this is our messianic period, meaning the world messianic period, we're giving rights. As this fellow who went through it, who I met 25 years ago, said to me, 30 years ago, he said to me, you wouldn't understand, you had yeshiva bochers throwing off their tefillin, becoming communists. This idea of a new future, a new hope, always the Jews are the first to believe in such things. It's a naivete that we have, but we're always the first ones. The Jews are all, in my opinion, the Jews were the only ones who actually believed in communism.
Yes, but Rav Kook,
I don't think the Russians actually believed in it.
With all due respect, because you are using the word naivete, isn't it naive to believe that the ones who did not rebel would have been able to settle and conquer the land of Israel? Isn't that naive to believe?
Yes, yes, it is. It almost happened. Remember, you had the students of the Vilna Gaon who came to Israel from 1806, from 1808. First, a few hundred of them over a 2-3 year period, but then others came in other waves, and there were already a few thousand coming from Lithuania and Belarus. They really did want to settle the land, but they didn't really have a plan of what's the next step. They didn't really have a political plan. Even Chovevei Tzion, the Russian Zionist movement, Chibat Tzion, which starts around 1864, also didn't really have a plan. They had the first Aliyah in 1882, built a few Moshavot, Rishon LeZion, Zichron Yaakov, Nachlat Shiva, a few others, but they really didn't have a plan of how to go step by step to have a state. Herzlian Zionism is the first attempt to become very political and trying to get a state. Even though Herzl doesn't bring the goods when he brings the Uganda plan which would have had a state in Kenya from the British. And you wonder if the British were just playing around with him with such a plan. But he really was focused on how we're going to get a state developed. And it took, I think, in that sense, more worldly Jews to figure out such a plan. Rav Kook writes specifically in our play Tohar. He says, I'll say in my own language, as he would say before, sometimes things have to happen in a way that you would not expect it, because if it would have taken the traditional Jews, it would have taken many centuries. Because, as you said, which Rosh Yeshiva is going to tell boys to pick up weapons and start fighting for a state, knowing that thousands of them are going to fall on the battlefields? It's a different mindset. Ben Gurion was like that, whether you liked him or not, but he was like that. You know, when I worked at Beit Tfutzot for a number of months, so they had a display at that time on the first floor. It was about Nachum Sokolov. Nachum Sokolov was a Zionist who lived most of the time actually outside of Israel. And Sokolov was interviewed there. And Sokolov says that he had an interview. He was once speaking with David Ben Gurion. And Ben Gurion says to Sokolov, he says, I am a bigger Zionist than you are, Nachum. He says, why? Ben Gurion says, because at the Battle of Latrun in 1948, I took men right off the boats from Europe, from the Shoah, and I gave them guns and sent them to fight for the Jewish state, knowing that a third of them would not return. And you would not be able to do that. And I'm quoting Sokolov, said this is what Ben Gurion told him. And he's right, most people would not be able to do that. And, I'm not standing in judgment, but I'm just saying it's a mindset which most of us cannot do.
So for the sake of the conversation and the shiur, and just to dig deeper into that question, it's I think it's a key question
it's not an easy question.
Rav Kook's.
And how would we have looked at it, let's say, if they had failed to establish the state of Israel? Then all those losses would have not been justified retroactively.
Yes. So,
but for Ben Gurion, the Shoah itself was enough reason to justify the losses. Because in his mind, there was no turning back. It was like with your back against the wall, and the wall was going in your direction.
So the question is, where does Rav Kook stand? How far does he go into that idea, into that thought?
So
for the national Teshuva.
The national Teshuva has to happen. Rav Kook actually believes that it had to happen by Jews who rebelled against Judaism because they were going to do things that traditional Jews would never do in a million years.
Okay, so the Rav Kook goes that far in his thought, yes.
He actually thinks that this is the way it was supposed to happen. He says it's also an interesting rebellion because they're not really rebelling against Judaism because their Zionism is their new Jewish consciousness. I've always said that the early Zionists were not secularists. They were what we call today Chozrim B'Sheila is one of the, meaning somebody who came from a religious background and became secular. It's a different mindset. If you are a second or third generation secular, you have no real Jewish identity. If you grew up in a religious home and you rebelled, you still have a very strong Jewish identity. Because in your rebellion, you're carrying a Jewish identity. And therefore, these secularists really saw the state of Israel as a Jewish state. This was not just a socialist endeavor, like some people try to paint it. The kibbutz movement was not a socialist movement. It was a Jewish socialist movement. And when I say Jewish, I don't mean just by Jews. This was a new Jewish identity. It was not a state for the Jews. It was a Jewish state, 100%, not even a question.
May I ask you another question? does Rav Kook draw parallels between the end of different exiles, the exile of Mitzrayim, the exile of Babylon, and the last exile of Rome? Can we draw parallels? Is that something in the traditional thought that the rabbis work with?
I'm not sure if Rav Kook draws parallels. I've heard parallels in Yerushalayim mentioned by different rabbis and Kabbalists who claim that in the Second Temple period, if you remember, the Second Temple period, the country was destroyed because of inner rivalry. And you had the Tzedukim, and you had the Prushim, and then you had the Biryonim, the Zealots, who fought against the rabbis, and Jerusalem fell apart. And our Teshuva is that we're in certain ways we're very similar to the Second Temple period. Our Teshuva is overcoming these schisms, and it's not easy because we're very much like the shtetl mentality in Israel, very provincial. We like fighting each other, and so it's not easy to get out of that. It's a real switch of mindset. That's why it's very important that we get more Western Jews into Israel who are able to switch that mentality. Because the Jews who were born here, who came from the shtetl, who were survivors of the countries that they came from, they're very much into survival mode. 85% of the people who came to Israel ran away from something where their life was threatened. Whether we're talking about the 1930s, running away from Nazi Germany, or they're talking about the late 1940s, running away from the Shoah after it was finished, whether we're talking about the 1950s, running away from North Africa, from the Arab countries, whether we're talking about the late 1950s, running away from Poland, another 100,000, 60,000 Jews, whether we're talking about the 1970s, running away from Soviet Russia, the 1990s, post-Soviet Russia, the Beta Yisrael Ethiopian Jews, everybody was running away. We have a country of survivors, of refugees. It's very unusual. I don't even know if there are other Jewish communities like that in the world, which has such a high percentage of people who are actually refugees. And this creates survival mode. Survival mode makes you tough, but it makes it harder to get along with your friend. When times are rough, you will support your friend because everybody realizes survival mode, we have to fight for everybody. But when times are less rough, you know what I mean? So the taxi driver will make money off you because you weren't born in Israel. And the guy in the shoe store will charge you 3 times and say it's made out of leather, etc., etc., etc. So, yeah. And nepotism. Nepotism is considered a mitzvah in Israel. I have to give a job to my cousin. It's considered a mitzvah. Nobody even thinks of it any other way. Yeah. So, yeah. So we went a little bit off course here. Let me just try to finish off. We can continue this next time. We were talking about general penitence. Okay, we just started that, so we can talk about general. We'll see that general penitence is the idea of society and the world at large, raising the world to perfection. It's the next step after particularized penitence, which pertains to the personal life of individuals, etc. So that we'll talk about next time. So from this point on, in chapter 4, Rav Kook will talk about general penitence, how society also needs to do tshuva. And that, of course, happens not just on the individual level, on the collective level. Societal tshuva is having a good health system, having good government, having good police forces, not starting wars for nothing, right? These are not easy things. And it's not easy. The individual can't really affect this as much. And it's easier for do personal tshuva than to do national tshuva or international tshuva. To perfect society, it's not easy. This is one of the more difficult things. You would think today it's easier because of the fact we have the internet and ways of talking to large masses of people, but as we know, this can also be controlled. So it's not a simple situation, but it has to be done in the end. Okay, so these things will be addressed, and we'll talk about it again then or next week. So, at Khan, I will stop.